Tonight on Greater Boston from the Boston Public Library. The U.S. moves ahead to the next stage of the World Cup in the face of human rights abuses in host Qatar. What do we lose when we just shut up and play and watch? The Boston Globe's Marcela Garcia and former Northeastern Athletic Director Peter Roby join me. Then a new cancer screening process promises to reduce cancer deaths by detecting tumors when they're still small and curable. I'll talk to two people from a local healthcare firm who've taken the test and are behind the effort to bring it to the rest of us. Every 4 years, the World Cup unites billions of fans around the globe in a celebration of the planet's most popular sport. But when the host country has huge stadiums along with huge human rights abuses, where do you draw the line between sportsmanship and sports washing? The controversy surrounding this year's World Cup began more than a decade ago, when the organization behind the Cup, FIFA, first announced Qatar would be the host, prompting allegations of corruption, outrage over human rights abuses in the country that include the treatment of migrant workers who build the stadiums, 400 to 500 of whom Qatar officials have finally admitted died in the process after originally putting the number at just 3. Qatar is also known for its laws criminalizing homosexuality and the LGBTQ community, which many teams plan to protest with pride-themed armbands until FIFA banned them, both on the field and off. And it's not just Qatar. FIFA has also moved to block protests against Iran as the UN investigates the country's deadly crackdown on protesters, as many as 500 of whom have been killed over demonstrations prompted by the death of a 22-year-old woman, Mahsa Amini, who died in custody of the so-called morality police. Still, the games have gone on as scheduled with minimal pushback, full participation from every national team which qualified, including the U.S., which knocked Iran out of the competition today with a 1-0, I believe you call it, win. So where is the outrage and where should it be? As the Boston Globe's Marcela Garcia put it in her latest column, soccer, especially in the World Cup, has a way of inducing temporary amnesia about ethical dilemmas while summoning outsized nationalism. A lot of us suffer from that disease. She joins me now along with Peter Roby, former athletic director for Northeastern University. Peter, Marcela, good to see you both. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Marcela, did you watch today?
Yes, I did, from my office.
Do you feel conflicted doing it or no?
No.
You're an honest woman.
Admit that I'm not.
How about you, Peter? Did you watch?
Yeah, I watched the last part of it. I had been out earlier in the day, and so I watched the ending and was able to see the U.S. win.
So are we enabling, and I watched part of it too, so it's 3 for 3. Are we enabling bad behavior? I mean, the game the other day against England was the most watched soccer or football match in U.S. history. I'm sure today's numbers are even higher. Are we enablers, Peter, when we watch?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, the people have a passion for the sport, and they have a right to watch it. You know, I think, if anything, FIFA enabled by giving the bid to a country that has the kind of abuses and philosophies that they have about suppression and discrimination and oppression. And that's really more the issue. And FIFA, for all of its protestations about wanting equality and trying to do the right thing in terms of inclusiveness, you know, your values are on display with the kinds of decisions that you make. And this is one of those examples.
Well, they want their pocket stuff. We'll get back to FIFA in a minute. I want to spend another minute trying to move either of you on the individual, because I'm frankly much more torn than maybe you are. Peter, in your wonderful column, Marcela, you talk about the fact that you come from a country, Mexico, where there's wild excitement about this, including you, even though you've never been to a match. You acknowledge the human rights abuses, the treatment, mistreatment of migrant workers, on and on and on. You even admitted, sort of, that you bought your dog a Mexico jersey. So how do you deal with that? Do you just buy into that amnesia thing you wrote about and say, it is what it is, let them play the games?
I think the trade-off for me is that it makes me feel something. It's national pride. And maybe that's where you and I differ, because you're not a soccer fan. And even admittedly, I haven't been to a soccer match. I don't really care about soccer. I only care about soccer every 4 years. But it's because there's this national pride involved. I think to put it in an analogy that maybe Americans can understand, it's like the Olympics. You want, people are watching how many gold medals the U.S. is winning all the time. And that's sort of like a national thing to do because it involves national pride in your country. And it's similar like this. So the trade-off is that, rooting for your team, for your sort of homeland, me as an immigrant in a country that doesn't really care that much about the sport, and it's a thing that unites all Mexicans, it really means something. And at the end of the day, to go back to Peter's point about FIFA, it really, and not to put the blame only on FIFA, but I'm totally going to do that because I don't think there's no one in the planet that would defend FIFA as an organization. It's one of the most corrupt international bodies in sports.
Well, there's some serious competition with the International Olympic Committee, which we'll get to.
True.
And I know we're going to get to FIFA and the IOC in a second. But Peter, I've known you for years, and much of your career has been talking about what are ethical responsibilities and behaviors of athletes themselves. We have the Iranian players who obviously lost today, who in their first match showed unimaginable courage by not singing the national anthem. Subsequent to that, their families back home were threatened with death or torture, and they did the understandable thing. But is there an obligation on athletes who come from countries that won't go home to that kind of thing to show support for the women of Iran, for example, or LGBTQ people in the host country, or does it all fall on the big boys, the FIFAs and the IOCs?
No, I think the players probably wanted to do more. I think their governing bodies probably restricted them from doing whatever, and the rules from FIFA around what was going to be allowed and what not was going to be allowed was probably on display. But you had players that were trying to wear the rainbow armbands and other things to personify their support for the LGBTQ community. And so, I think those were some attempts, but the players have worked 4 years to try to get to this point. It would be a huge sacrifice for people to ask them to do something that might put them at risk of not being able to participate. And so I get that. And that's why I come back to the governing bodies and their responsibilities.
Well, yeah, but one more thing about that. I understand. I think it was 7 Western European countries, the captains of those teams, Peter, were going to wear that One Love armband. And when they were threatened with a yellow warning, which I guess means if it turns out you get 2 of them, you get kicked out of the match, they backed off. But just look at our own team. U.S. Soccer itself, the institution, did that thing with the Iranian flag to show solidarity with the people of Iran, the protesters. And the coach of the team said, we have nothing to do with that. We just want to be here to play the game. What risk was the coach and the U.S. team at to stand side by side with U.S. Soccer and show some solidarity with the people of Iran?
Probably no risk that we would suggest, but how do we know what the conversations have been like behind the scenes with the governing bodies? And so, look, I think coaches at that point, every 4 years, it's the biggest stage. You're trying to prepare your team, and you want to try to minimize distraction. So they were prepared to do what they could under the circumstances. So you're right. I've spent my whole life trying to do and say the right things and make people aware of the things that are important. And I think that the responsibilities lie with other people in this case.
So let's go back to what you both said, Marcela. You talked about FIFA. I'm not even in agreement with you there, even though the FIFA through the years has shown such grotesque corruption, even though they've been acquitted on a number of criminal charges. It seems to me it falls to the democracies, particularly of the West. If the United States grouped together with its allies and said to the International Olympic Committee or FIFA in the case of World Cup, we're not going to places like Qatar, we're not going to China, we're not going to Russia, we're not going to places that are grotesque violators of human rights, the money dries up and the games don't happen. So don't we have more control than we let on?
We do, but it's in the opposite direction. I think people really want to watch the World Cup. And to Peter's point before, Iranian players probably wanted to play. They've been working hard to get here. It is a huge huge honor as athletes to be in the World Cup. And so I think that, again, that trade-off is, look, did you remember the Iranian who was prisoner, the Washington Post columnist, Jason
Rezaian? He's been on the show many times, sure.
He wrote an op-ed saying why he was supporting Iran in the World Cup. And so, again, it's this, I get the conflict, but the sport is so big around the world, and the fans are so invested in this international tournament every 4 years that I think, that's what makes. Look, Denmark and Germany were trying to boycott the World Cup, and it didn't happen. Why did you think it didn't happen? Because ultimately, I think the fans wanted their team to play in the World Cup. And Germany is one of the best teams.
They are. Peter, I wasn't aware until a couple of days ago when I was reading about the awarding of the World Cup to Qatar, I think it was in 2010, that unlike a lot of the other Olympic decisions where the IOC says, hey, they don't put it quite this way, we have no choice but to go, let's say, to Russia because nobody else is in the bidding or those who were withdrew. My understanding is the U.S., South Korea, Japan was in the mix. Am I being naive when I say if the U.S. stood shoulder to shoulder with a bunch of other wealthy countries and said, we want it in South Korea, we want it in Japan, whatever it is, they'd carry the day, would they not?
I don't think so. I think that there's so many countries around the world that care so deeply about football, as they say,
in Europe.
They call it. Yeah,
the power is in Europe.
They would never allow the U.S. and its allies to kind of flex their muscle, if you will, on a sport that was late in coming to the U.S. Compared to some of the other countries that have been playing it for centuries. So, I hear what you're saying, but even with the television money that FIFA benefits from the U.S. Networks. My sense is that others would prevail in that situation. That's just my take on the type of complexity and the influence that other countries have when it comes to a sport like soccer or football, as they call it around the world.
I should say I have great respect for both of you. It appears I struck on every single count. So let me end with this, Marcela, if I can. How'd your dog look in the Mexico jersey?
Amazing. I posted a picture on Instagram, and he looked like he agreed, because I think he knows he's Mexican American too.
Apparently,
he's a bilingual dog. He's a bilingual dog.
Marcela Garcia, Peter Roby, as always, I really appreciate your thoughts. Thanks so much, both of you.
Thank you for having us.
All the best.
Next up, this year alone, nearly 2 million people will be diagnosed with some form of cancer in the U.S. And while, of course, the treatment that follows is the hard part, for many, just trying to get a diagnosis in time is a challenge. Right now, there are routine screenings for just 5 types of cancer: prostate, colon, cervical, breast, and in some high-risk patients, lung cancer. For the other dozens of forms of cancer, patients are often on their own when it comes to noticing symptoms, finding specialists, and then undergoing testing. All of that can take months or even years, time that without treatment can drastically worsen a cancer patient's prognosis. That's the problem my next guests hope to solve. Susan Downard is the director of clinical pharmacy at Point 32 Health, the parent company of Tufts Health Plan and Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare. Peter Church is the chief people officer there. Peter and Susan, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Susan, starting with you, I want to make sure I'm right. I mentioned the 5 cancers for which there's currently screening. I want to be clear. The notion here is this test has potential to detect some of the most dangerous, ovarian, pancreatic, that sort of thing, and others that we couldn't detect this early in the past. Am I right there?
That's correct.
And you have a personal connection here, do you not? This is not just professional, but it's very personal. Tell us about that.
Yes, I do. My father was diagnosed with lung cancer, and he passed away after living with it for about 15 years after having a lung removed, being on oxygen for a long period of time. And
you took the test?
I did.
Did you have any doubts or concerns about doing it? Were you anxious?
I was anxious. I actually had an incidental finding several years ago that I had a node on my lung. And I had an abdominal CT. They accidentally found a node on my lung and said, "How long have you had this node?" and I didn't know about it. And so that made me nervous that I was at risk of having lung cancer. And obviously my dad had had lung cancer. My grandfather had been diagnosed with lung cancer. He did not pass away from it. And so I was concerned and interested in being screened.
And obviously, when you got the results, your fears were allayed, from what I understand, correct?
Yes.
So Peter, you're quoted in the Boston Globe story this saying employers have a greater responsibility to worry about the well-being of employees in these times. Can you connect the dots for us a little bit and tell us why?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think employers over the past 24, 36 months, we've all been challenged significantly with the events of COVID and the global pandemic and all that it's brought us. But even before that, social issues were taking greater prominence in the workplace, ranging from the Me Too movement. And of course, with the murder of George Floyd, it's had an overwhelming impact on the psychology of our workers. How people care for one another, what people feel when they come to work, which, of course, during the pandemic, many colleagues were at their homes. And so as an employer, I believe that we're in the middle of a period of time where there's a bit of a paradigm shift, where the care for colleagues, the care for each other inside of an organization, that's one of the things we have responsibility to do to ensure that people can do their best work, particularly for an organization like ours that cares for so many in our community.
Now, Peter, I know the test, at least as of the moment, is $949. It's not covered by insurance. Would that situation change should there be FDA final approval here?
Well, for Point 32 Health and our partnership, what we felt was particularly important was being able to offer this as a novel medical invention, so to speak, for our colleagues at no cost.
No, I meant beyond your operation.
Oh, I apologize.
That's okay.
Regrettably, that's a little bit beyond my scope, how we would think about that. My hope would be, and I think it would be that of all colleagues, is that this becomes some sort of a benefit or an assessment that you would like any other diagnostic in doctor offices, et cetera.
I want to get back to that in a second. Susan, with great trepidation, I'm going to ask you the following question. Could you explain, I told you before we went on, my science knowledge could fit in a very small thimble. Could you explain how this works in layperson's language?
Sure. So I really took this as a patient, but I think it really screens for many different types of cancer. And it does, in the end, it is a blood test, so it's non-invasive. And the test can tell you what type of cancer. So you do come out telling that you either have a negative cancer signal detected or a positive cancer signal. And the positive cancer signal would tell you what type of cancer. It's not just you have cancer. It's that it tells you what type. And then you would go for further testing to validate that and to actually, confirm some sort of diagnosis.
And further testing is key because there obviously can be, and I assume are, false positives, correct?
I think with any type of testing, there certainly could be some kind of false positive.
Peter, I want to return to the cost for a second, and maybe if this is outside your bailiwick, feel free to say it. There are 254 members of Congress, a bipartisan group, who are sponsoring a bill that would cause Medicare to cover this test. And I think it may be in part because, as I think probably some viewers know, this kind of test is something that President Biden has embraced as part of the cancer moonshot that he has been doing for years and years as both vice president and now as president of the United States. But there was an analysis done in the New York Times that said if this bill were to become law, and the 60 million, I think, Medicare recipients were to have access to this test, it has potential to raise the overall cost of the Medicare program by 7%. That's a huge kind of number. So in your position, while I totally respect the notion you want to lay a lot of the concerns that employees of yours and others have, do you not worry about overutilization?
Well, I appreciate how you preface this. I think probably the general nature of the questions outside of my bailiwick. What I would offer, though, is this: is that when us as an employer, when we think about offering benefits to our colleagues, one of the things we're trying to be thoughtful about is the impact it has on their livelihood. and their lives and that of their families. So when we have opportunities like this that has perhaps a front-end investment, but a huge opportunity to avoid additional costs or additional medical expense down the road, there's real thought that has to go into that. So, I've stayed clear of politics most of my adult life, but I do think it's really important for us all to understand that front-end investment of any amount that yields huge benefits long-term, that's the eye we need to have.
Well, I mean, it's not obviously, let me state the obvious, as I said in the beginning, early detection of even small tumors obviously is going to save lives. But can we talk, Susan, this is part of your bailiwick, talk a couple, I wouldn't say criticisms, but concerns. I think most people watching know about the whole deal with the PSA test for prostate cancer. Historically, strongly recommended, I think, for 55 to 69-year-old men. And then the controversy arose when the notion was that it was detecting slow-growing tumors that in many cases were harmless, and there was a backing off. Do you not worry about similar concerns here?
Yeah, I think as a pharmacist, that's a bit out of my scope because I'm not a physician.
However.
Right. However, I think in testing any time, we need to think about testing the right population of people and how we use the results that we get.
What is the right population of people? Because there's also another issue, Susan, if I can stay with you, or Peter, whoever wants to answer this. I assume since there are false positives, as you said before, Susan, with virtually anything, you then do the further testing or imaging, as you were suggesting, is required. If you get that first positive and then you subsequently find out you don't have cancer, it doesn't mean the anxiety goes away. I can imagine in myself, it would sort of stay in my body. So, Susan, starting with you, who is this recommended for? Who is the population? What's the population that should be thinking seriously about taking this when it's available?
Maybe Pete could talk about the population that this was offered to at Point 32 Health.
Okay, fine. How about it, Peter?
Yeah, sure. So our initial pass with this was to offer this to our colleagues who are age 50 and older, who met certain eligibility criteria. One of the things that we felt was real important was exactly as you say, although not so focused on false positive, but just the possibility that you may get a result that is positive. And so when we introduced this, we also provided counseling to those individuals that should you receive positive results, you have the option to reach out and have some additional support and work through whatever additional questions you might have. We have since that time extended our population to age 40 and older, and who meet certain criteria. So age 40 and older within our workforce are eligible to have access to.
Peter, do you have any idea about what is the likely timetable for this to be more generally available to the broader population?
So I know that our commercial markets team and our medical team are coordinating what the timeline would be for that, but I don't have the specific dates to go with that.
Susan, you have any thoughts on that or no?
No, my involvement really has been as a patient who has, taken the test.
Well, I have to say it is very exciting and has huge positive potential. Susan, Peter, thank you for your work and thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That's it for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget Ukraine.
Hey folks, Edgar B. Herwick III here from GBH's Curiosity Desk, where you ask questions and I find answers. Today's question came our way on Twitter from Emily Warden. Now, when I first saw this question, I was like, yes, that is so good. Microwaves do all sound the same. And then I was like, but wait a minute, do they sound exactly the same? I mean, I know they sound alike, but like exactly the same? Let's put it to the test. Okay, so I quickly got my hands on every microwave I could find here at WGBH. My apologies to James in accounting. I'm gonna set them all to 5 seconds, and then I'm gonna put them on in succession. We should be able to hear a bunch of tones at the same time. That should really give us a sense of if they are exactly the same or not. Yep, so they're all right there between a B and a B sharp. Not exactly the same, but pretty darn similar. And it turns out there is a reason for that. Popcorn. For decades, the same piece of technology was used in nearly all microwaves to generate that classic microwave sound, a little device called a piezoelectric buzzer.
It's essentially a membrane that vibrates and is electrically charged and vibrates to create a sound, very similar to the way a speaker works.
Piezoelectricity was first described by Pierre and Jacques Curie way back in 1880. It is essentially an electric charge that can accumulate in certain materials when physical pressure is applied. That part piezo comes from a Greek word that means press or squeeze. Now the piezoelectric buzzer harnesses that charge to generate that simple beep. It was first brought to market by Japanese manufacturers in the 1950s and quickly proved to be a worldwide hit. Now, on the one hand, they're pretty versatile, used not just in microwaves, but also smoke alarms and timers and all sorts of gadgets. On the other hand, they are extremely limited in what they can do.
We could set the frequency, but we couldn't do much more than that. The frequency and the length of that note was about all we had available to us.
This is why, for decades, nearly all microwaves have sounded the same. But today, it is a whole different ballgame. Thanks to digital technologies developed mainly for mobile phones, a veritable symphony of sounds is now available literally at the touch of a button.
There, so you'll hear that little beep at the end of it, but it's a lot more organic, it's a lot more musical, and it's a lot more subtle and nuanced.
This new world order does present some challenges. After all, that iconic microwave beep might not be spellbinding, but it is deeply familiar. Designers like Hughes have to come up with just the right combination of bleeps and blurps that says, hey, your popcorn is ready, just as effectively.
That's the main objective we're trying to accomplish, is communicate to you in a meaningful way and a thoughtful way that your task's complete.
Don't forget to like and subscribe, and perhaps most importantly, let me know what you are curious about, because as you can see, I might just look into it for you. I'm Edgar B. Horwick III. Stay curious out there. Oh, that was it though. See? That was it though. All right. You gotta go back. You gotta throw it a little bit back. That's the technique.
The Curiosity Desk is sponsored by Emerson College, inspiring curiosity and creative expression in all of us.